Hey y'all, in this video we're going to be going over how to solve trig equations, so let's get right into it. This is the first equation we're going to be going over. A lot of these are going to be pretty basic, but it's just to get the fundamentals of how to do this, so you can jumpstart and hop right into learning more about it. So this first equation, 6 cosine of theta plus 4 equals 1. To newcomers to trig, this might seem kind of daunting because they're not used to saying cosine or sine of theta or theta in general in an equation, but I want to stress that everybody knows this coming into this, or at least I really hope everybody would know how to do this, because effectively all you need to do is treat that cosine of theta like its own variable and solve from there, pretending almost that it's just like x. So we just need to isolate it onto one side. We subtract 4 from both sides of the equation, divide by 6 on both sides, and we're left with cosine of theta equals negative 1/2. So from here is where it gets different than your average just 6x plus 4 equals 1. From here, what we need to do is we need to find the cosine inverse of negative 1/2. So on our calculators, we'd press second cosine to get cosine inverse, and then plug in negative 1/2, and it'd give us 120 degrees. Some people might be shouting right now that you don't need to use your calculator, because our handy dandy unit circle tells us that negative 1/2 for cosine is already 120 degrees and 240 degrees. But it's good practice to use our calculators, because our calculators will help us solve for equations that don't fit into our unit circle. So that's why I'm going to be going over this. It's really important, and I just want to get that down. So our calculator will only give us the answer of 120 degrees initially. And we know that that's not true. We know that there has to be 2 answers. So pretty much what we need to do is we need to find the reflection of that 120 degrees over the x-axis. Because cosine, aka the x value in your unit circle, is always going to be consistent over the x-axis. So whatever point you're given, you either find a reference angle. So in this case, it would be a 60 degrees reference angle from 180, and we'd add that to 180 to get 240, or we just take whatever angle we're given and subtract it from 360, because effectively 0 to 120 is a positive 120 degree angle, whereas 360 to 240 is the same thing as a negative 120 degree angle, which is the same thing, just reflected over the x-axis. So that's normally how I like to do it, is I take 360, subtract my angle, so 120, I'm given 240. And then we have to remember that whatever angles we have as our answer, so 120 and 240, we also have to keep in mind that it's plus or minus 360 degrees, because it's plus or minus any amount of full rotations, right? So it's 120 plus any other angle that is coterminal to 120. So this next equation is the exact same, except instead of cosine, it is sine. And the only reason that I put this one up here is to show and stress that the trig function that we use does heavily impact our answer. So we go about it the same way until we get to our sine of theta, and then we do second sine, so sine inverse of negative 1/2, and out pops 30 degrees in our calculator. So the big difference between sine and cosine when we're solving like this is that instead of reflecting over the x-axis, our answer now reflects over the y-axis. So we can't just subtract 30 from 360, because that doesn't give us the right answer. Instead, we need to find the reference angle, in this case just 30 degrees, and subtract it from 180 degrees, because that's where our y value, or our sine, remains consistent, reflected over this y-axis. Same would go for if our answer was 210 degrees. We would take that 210, we'd try to reflect it over the y-axis, get 330. Our reference angle is 30, so we take 30, subtract it from 360 to get 330. But in this case, 30 to 150. And both of these answers, like stated before, plus or minus 360 so plus or minus any full rotations of the circle for either of those angles. This problem is a slightly more complex problem that builds off of what we just learned from the other ones. So this one is a cosine problem, 6 cosine 2 theta, that'll come into hand, don't worry, plus 5 equals 1. So we subtract 5 from both sides, divide by 6 on both sides, and we get cosine 2 of theta equals negative 2/3. Now this right here is why I wanted to use the calculator for the other problems, because negative 2/3 does not appear in our unit circle at all, and so it's good practice that now we know how to use our calculators to solve for it. So we do cosine inverse of negative 2/3, and out pops 131.8 degrees. So this is a very strange, weird number, and instead of finding the reference angle for it, I just subtracted it from 360 to get 228.2. Feel free to find the reference angle of 131.8, but it's a little bit more work. Just whatever floats your boat, whatever method is easiest and most consistent for you to find that second angle. So both of these answers, just like we went over before, is plus or minus 360 degrees, any amount of full rotations from that angle. But we are left with this 2 theta. This coefficient of the theta can't be solved for any earlier in this equation. It is inside the cosine. We have to solve everything else and then the cosine to get these answers, and then we can deal with the 2. That's a key thing you have to remember. But the weird thing is, when we deal with this 2, we divide by 2, and everything on this side of the equal sign is divided by 2. Our angles, our rotations, our other angles, everything about it. So our 131 becomes 65.9 right here. Our 228 becomes 114.1 right here. And then instead of a full rotation, we are now doing a 180 degree rotation. So technically, these lines extend all the way down into here and into here. And that is something we have to keep in mind. This is a good beginner problem, something a bit more intermediate that gets down the techniques of everything that you will be dealing with in the future of solving trig equations. And if you're able to get all of this stuff down and you're able to memorize it, you will have a good time solving later. It's a good basis to build off of, and that's just something that I really, really want to stress and keep in mind as something that's important, because it will appear a lot and it might trip a lot of people up, but there's no reason to be scared by it. It is something that you are totally capable of doing as long as you don't get overwhelmed, and just remember to treat it like a normal equation. So yeah, that's the video. Thank you so much.